All right, before we jump into this topic, yesterday we had Mayor Slay with us and Chief Dotson. And I don't know if some of you saw what happened in St. Louis last night and this morning. Unfortunately, another person was shot and broke out. So our St. Louis leadership had to go back. So let's keep them in our thoughts and prayers. And I think while we're here, and I think Mayor Nutter and others said it yesterday, things are happening every minute, every hour while we're actually sitting here in our respective cities. And when we think things got quelled a little bit in the St. Louis, Ferguson area, there's still more activity going on. So again, it makes what we're doing here relevant and really, really important. So our thoughts and prayers go out to Mayor Slay. We have our host mayor here who obviously is doing some very important work in our community. And I'm really excited that he and his chief, Keith Buckner, who you heard a little bit from yesterday, was sworn in as chief of police in Little Rock in June. And he had been a police officer in Louisville, 1993, became assistant chief in that department in 2011, and demonstrated in Louisville that he's a strong advocate for community policing. Based on his experience, he's committed to intelligent-led police modeling for Little Rock and public involvement in the development of policing models. So let's give a round of applause for Little Rock in the house. And then on my left, we have the mayor of New Haven, Toni Harp. She became the 50th mayor of New Haven, the first female mayor last November, following more than 2 decades in the state Senate, where she earned the title of the conscience of the Senate. Among her signature efforts in public service has been her support for a responsive and effective public safety network, working hand in hand with our equitable criminal justice system. And to our left, we have the chief of New Haven Police Department. He's been there since November of 2011. Prior to that, he served as chief of police in Providence, and prior to that, in Stamford. His reputation as a champion of community policing had his start in New Haven, where in the 1990s, he served as a deputy to then police chief Pastor, implementing regular walking beats for officers in neighborhoods, which he referenced a little bit yesterday, and other essential elements of successful community policing. Let's give New Haven a round of applause this morning. All right, Mayor, we think Mayor Stodola can start us off since it's his hometown. You go first, and then your chief, and then we'll go to New Haven.
Very good. Thank you, Mayor Johnson, and good morning to everyone. I hope you all had a great time yesterday evening. We hope you've had a chance to enjoy our city. This particular panel session is called Effective City, School, and Police Partnerships. And as I began to think through my comments, I was trying to challenge myself on whether or not I think these kinds of things are effective or not, particularly when most of us do not control our schools, and we have to work with an independent school board. And so I try to figure out, well, is it effective or not? And I want to give you a little history about what we've been doing in terms of youth programming to kind of give a focus to this issue. Back in 1993 and 94, I think I mentioned yesterday that I was a prosecutor for 3 terms. And in 1993, we had a population of about 175,000 people here in Little Rock. We're now at about 210. And when we talked about, as Mitch Landry talked about, you reduce crime and you show the graph and it shows it's going down and down and down, and yet people are still upset, still concerned. That's certainly something that happened. In 1993, we were reporting over 27,000 UCR Part 1 crimes to the FBI. In 1993, I had 113 homicides in Pulaski County, 76 homicides in the city of Little Rock alone. We had a huge gang problem. We had a problem, as I mentioned, keeping witnesses alive in order to testify. It was a very serious problem that we had. The citizens of the city decided that we were going to pass a sales tax then, and we were going to try and do something about it. Obviously, that's what led to us hiring more police officers, but the commitment was made by the community to take an equal amount of money and put it into prevention and intervention programming in terms of the human capital issues. And so back in 1993 or 1994, after it passed, we have consistently put over $3 million into community programming for prevention and intervention dealing with young people. I think we were probably one of the first cities around the country that back in 1994 were putting that substantial amount of money into that kind of human capital programming issues. And so we developed the Department of Community Programs, and we have been working long and hard on that issue. In 2011, I led another sales tax election in the middle of the recession, and we talked very candidly with our citizens, and we were successful in passing that sales tax for some much-needed issues in our police department and our public works and a variety of things. But most importantly, again, we added another $3 million to our prevention and intervention programming. So now we're spending about $6 million a year on trying to keep kids from getting in trouble in a very specific way. So I brought with me, and I've got this handout here for those of you who might be interested, also talking about a career center that we have and some information you might be interested in. It's down here in the center table. I got to use this. I'll give you one later. But this talks about our Department of Community Programs, and I wanted to just briefly highlight those issues and then tell you where I think we're going on these issues. We've got basically 7 different program concepts that we deal with. One's neighborhood-based programs, where we deal with kids after school, Monday through Friday, and it's targeted toward youth that are ages 6 to 11 and also 12 to 17. And it provides opportunities for them to receive some consistent, caring, and we think nurturing relationships with an adult, many of whom don't have that caring, nurturing relationship. Recreational and social activities with their peers, and certainly trying to work with the families and the neighborhoods that they live in. And then also learning and testing new skills through educational and cultural and mentoring activities. That's one of our major programs. We've got 13 different providers. Some of these are faith-based organizations. Others are obviously all nonprofits. We then, back in 1994, because of the gang problem I mentioned, we developed what we call a youth intervention program. And this is for the very highly at-risk individuals who are at greater risk of being recruited to go into gangs or actually in gangs. There are 3 components there. We certainly try to recruit kids that we know that 24 hours a day are at risk. We do enrichment and empowerment programs, and we have coordinators that are on call 24 hours a day, and they are targeted in geographic areas of the city. We know where these young people live, and so we target those neighborhoods with that. And of course, these people develop a more direct relationship because they are working with them at all hours of the day and night. So there's life skills development, community service, character building. We try to do some education and tutoring, and certainly the social and recreational activities, trying to prevent and to intervene in the cycle that so often our young people find themselves in. And so we've got about 9 different providers for that as well, and that is targeted toward our adolescent teenagers. We then have some other programs that I wanted to mention. And I tell you all these programs because we've been doing this now for a long time, and I still challenge myself to see how effective these things are sometimes. You know, when kids do not get in trouble, and we've talked about this in my Brother's Keeper organization, which I'm a member of. We've talked about it in Cities United. It's very hard to prove a negative. So when you're preventing somebody from getting in trouble, how do you know whether you really have an evidence-based program that's really working? I don't know how you do that other than you look at it and you try to decide, well, are truancies going down? Is juvenile crime going down? Are graduation rates going up? Is proficiency in 3rd grade reading improving? You've got to take and look at some of those things, I think, to decide on whether all these kinds of programs that we all work on are really effective. So we do an evening career center, which provides skills training for young youth or young adults, 18 to 24. We have a summer recreation program. We have over 1,800 kids that get into our program. We charge a total of $80 for the entire summer. That's all it costs for a family to have their kid there, and they bring them in. They can bring them in there at 6:30 in the morning and pick them up at 6 at night. $80 for the entire summer. We have summer youth employment programs. We employ over 600 young people each year, giving them jobs, trying to teach them about the responsibility of holding a job, how to communicate with adults, very important issue that many of our kids don't know how to do. And certainly then, finally, we've talked about it in another context, and that is we said, well, there's some programs out here and there are some organizations out here that do really good things that really do help. And so we've developed a whole enhancement program concept. So we are dealing with a variety of providers there, everything from dispute resolution to the symphony orchestra to our Museum of Discovery to First Tee and to a Center for Diversity at our university. All of these kinds of programs to try and enhance the opportunity to keep these kids from getting in trouble. I tell you that because we've now gone, when I became mayor in 2007, I talked about the number of homicides we had in 1993. Well, in 2006, we had 60 homicides that year. Very troubling. And frankly, I probably got elected because as a former prosecutor, I ran on a very tough anti-crime stance and was successful. And I'm thankful that we've been able to continue to reduce those statistics, but it's in large part due to the community helping us and in large part to good policing. We went down to a low of 24 homicides, still 24 too many, in 2011. We bounced back up a little bit, but we're now at a 30-year lows in terms of the number of UCR1 park crimes that are being reported. At about a little under 17,000. We kind of fluctuate, but the lowest we hit was about 16,800. Now, that's still way, way, way too many. It's not what I consider to be success, but it points out the fact that the issue of crime and public safety is still the #1 issue on people's minds. So you put that in the context now of contemporary analysis of these things and what we're doing with My Brother's Keeper, the disproportionate amount of violence among young men and boys of color. And you have to say, well, what more can you do? And we are beginning to work now, and I'm trying to figure out. And we all talk about this. We talk about it and wring our hands and pull our hair out and try to figure out, how terrible this situation is with people killing each other. But when you really talk about what programs are effective that can do something about this, it's really hard to pull it up to scale. And I think that's where a conference like this maybe helps us to try and figure out what other people are doing in terms of scale. I decided that we've got a school that it takes care of the worst of the worst. When a kid in the Little Rock School District cannot make it in their middle school or their high school, they get kicked into the worst school in the world, which is called Hamilton Learning Academy. And as I was told by the teachers there, it was about 180 kids in middle school and high school. They're not afraid of punishment. They're not afraid of their teachers. They're not afraid of juvenile court. They see that going to jail is certainly at some point in the future going to be a rite of passage. Of course, a very high dropout rate. The teachers, as a matter of fact, will go and get the daily county jail roster to see which of their students have been arrested the night before. I'm giving you that as the context of a group of people that if we want to really try and attack the crime rate and reduce crime in the city of Little Rock and reduce the amount of violence on the streets, if I could focus and if we can focus just on those 200 kids and figure out programming that's going to make a difference, we'll probably reduce the crime rate in the city of Little Rock. I firmly believe that. So they currently have some programs, and these are programs that are helping, but there's got to be more. They do taekwondo. They've got 100 black men. Some of you know about the Jack and Jill program, Gentlemen's Club, Young Fathers Club, Young Mothers Club. Most of them have been engaged in some sort of activity that puts them in those categories. And so we're going to be working on a more stringent mentoring program for these kids and to do job training, career counseling. When I met with the teachers to talk to them, because I know they spend about 7 or 8 hours a day with them, and I said, what motivates these people most? And the motivation, very clearly coming from all the teachers that I talked to, was money. money. They want a job. They want some element of success. So we are going to be working on a mentoring program and some educational programs that try to teach the responsibility of holding a job, earning an income, and then actually doing employment placement for them after school, after hours, and to see whether or not we can give them some pride in themselves and their ability to accomplish something that will make a difference. And so the big struggle I see that we have is that when we talk about moving the needle, when we talk about really changing the recidivism rates that we've been saddled with for 40 years, it's in the 45 to 50% range, we are going to have to focus on some things that are really going to I think, give people a sense of value of human life and a value of property. I, for one, think that the $6 million we're spending is certainly needed, but I, for one, believe that if we took all our money and started at birth, infancy, as a public health issue, and identified every kid that was born in our hospitals and tracked them and got them into the various programs that we all have in our cities and focused our money right there, that maybe in 10 years we'd really see a reduction in those crime rates. So I'm going to stop there and let Chief Buckner tell you about some of the other programs that we have through the police department and our kids in schools.
Good morning. First of all, I'd just like to thank the Conference of the Mayors for having this conference in Little Rock. We greatly appreciate that and kind of highlighting some of the good things that are going on across the country in our great city. Just to give you a little bit of a backdrop of our public schools that we have here in Little Rock. We have approximately 48 schools, 25,000 or so kids, ratio of about just shy of 15 kids to each teacher in the school. A couple of the programs that we have, one of which, because I know the title of this is Effective Partnerships, with me only being here for roughly 3 months, I don't know if I've seen enough to be able to make an intelligent decision not as to whether both the programs are effective or not. I have some concerns about one that I'm sure you're familiar with, which is our SRO program. I think often when we come to meetings such as this, we hear that new buzzword or that new program that's going out, and we rush and we implement it and we tout it, and every opportunity we get to say that, hey, we have a school resource officer program, we'll spit that out. But then if we go and we take a look at that to see, is it actually being effective? Is it actually doing what we designed it to do? That is where my questions and concerns come out. And if there's someone in the audience that has a program in difficult kind of demographic school districts, please share with me later as to what you're doing to get this program to where it's effective. In our school resource officer program, of course, the design was for us to, number one, to protect the schools, to provide a safe environment for our kids to be able to learn and our teachers to be able to teach. Equally important is to improve the relationship between the police and some of these at-risk kids that are in the schools that we're actually coming into contact with. That was paramount for me, that we have some kind of what I would call constructive contact with kids that does not involve law enforcement. I think that there's a dire need of that with police and our young folks. The program for us was established in 1993, so it's not like that we haven't just started this 5 years ago, 10 years ago. SROs have been in Little Rock since 1993. We have 19 officers and 2 sergeants that currently make up our roster for that. We're in 14 schools, 8 middle schools and 6 high schools. Here's some of the things that we actually train our officers on to ensure that they're kind of prepared to deal with the things that they need to deal with in the school. Active shooter drills, of course, that's important. Intellectually deficient students. Now, one of the challenges that we have with some of the schools, if the child has been deemed through I guess through medical or some other avenue to be a behavioral problem or some kind of mental issue or something, the school district can only suspend that kid 10 days for the school year. 10 days. So then the frustration becomes for our officers and our teachers that if you have a kid that does something completely egregious and they get a 2-day suspension for that, where everyone's looking at us with frustration, well, why can't you do more? But the reason is that the principals who are looking at the entire school year, they're trying to balance that out for the next time when that kid acts out. Because I've got 10 days that I can give this kid for the entire school year. So you see our frustration. The other thing, first responders, and including that for some of us around the country that are looking at to where, with that active shooter drill, to where we're actually going in during the incident while it still may be actively going on, and then bringing out some of those folks to triage them immediately on this maybe first or second floors, where maybe the incident may be going on that third or fourth floor. Juvenile intake, juvenile law, some of the other training, social media. One of the problems that social media has caused us in the schools, well, 20 years ago, if I had an issue or some kind of problem with the gentleman sitting here, and I said that, well, the next time I see him, I'm going to kick his butt. Well, he knew that we had a problem. When we see each other, we may have a fight. Well, now I'm posting that on Facebook. So 15 of his friends have seen it, 20 of my friends have seen it, and we all go to the same school. So this Monday, we had an incident to where 11 kids were involved in a fight. We had to mace them to break them up. There were 9 arrests made. So social media has caused a huge problem as it relates to getting a bunch of people in negative situations because this frenzy is kind of created because of this media outlet. Then the other thing is Child Protective Services and conflict resolution. One of the things when we do get an opportunity to have kind of programming in the schools, we want to talk to the kids about making good decisions, doing the right thing. But it's very limited as to when we have those opportunity to do some of the teaching with the kids, because the schools are also under pressure to make sure that these kids are receiving acceptable scores because of the pressure that they're having from the state and the federal levels for the monies that they're receiving. And then the problem we have is that when you have kids, this mad flee from the public school system because of some of the dynamics that I'm talking about. So there is a push to keep as many kids as you possibly can in a seat in the classroom, which is frustrating again to our officers who are trying to say, hey, this kid should not be here. We can't get anything done with this child in the room. But when these kids, the other kids are fleeing to go to these private schools, so you're stuck with almost trying to keep what kids that you have in your program. That's hugely disappointing for us and disappointing for the teachers who have to deal with that. If you're ever having a day as a police department to where you just say, man, I'm just frustrated, this is really bad, this is just a hell of a day that we're having, take one day, go up to one of your schools where that you're consistently having to send officers in there, spend a day in that school, and you'll change your prayers from the police department for the school system. I promise you. Just go up there one day and see what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So when I talk about concerns and why I would need some help from someone in the audience, if you're having something that you believe it's working in this kind of environment, we certainly would like to hear about that. Here's some of the problems specifically. The high number of arrests. We went from school resource officer by title to basically we've been turned into prison guards. And that sounds maybe abrasive, that sounds maybe offensive to someone, but call it what it is. When you're arresting kids 9, 10 at a time, you're security. You're not providing resources, you are simply security. The other issue is, one of the schools, I've received an email and we've been in school for a couple of months. I don't have any kids, so I don't know. We've been in school for a couple of months now. So one of our schools, we've already had 60 fights in one particular school. 60 fights. So to say that this is challenging in some of our schools is an understatement. The other thing, when you talk about multiple arrests, because you have that 10-day kind of suspension that you can't do, we're seeing these same kids getting locked up multiple times coming right back into the school. In the learning environment, what about the few kids who are actually there trying to learn something? What are they going to learn in an environment where you have these kind of things going on? Truancy. I recently had a conversation with our superintendent because we were spending an enormous amount of money on the truancy program, and we only had about 12 kids that it came through for 2013 through the actual truancy center. When we skipped school, or maybe I'm just talking for myself, we were actually, we were out running about, we would go somewhere, we would be doing something, playing. Well, we're not finding kids out walking around as it relates to the truants. For the most part, they're our daytime burglars. So we're, the Truancy Center, for the amount of money that we were spending versus the kids who were coming through there, through the Truancy Center, we saw it as pretty much a waste. So we've agreed to kind of do away with that and look for something else to be able to address that, but we have not come up with something as to how we're going to do that yet. And then the whole thing about the weapons. The number of weapons that we're taking off kids in the school, on property, in the school itself, increasing. So these problems only add to some of the other difficulties that we have. And then again, about the social media aspect, I've already touched on that. Now, just so I don't leave you to where you're thinking, oh my God, what's going on with this? We have a program that's actually a great program. And SROs, considering what they're facing and what they have to deal with, they do an outstanding job. I met with them personally. I wanted to feel them. I like to see what people do we have on the front line doing this. And there are a few key components to, I think, to any success model: the plan and the people. The people that I have as school resource officers, they're committed to what they're trying to do, but they're frustrated. One program that we have that I'm very, very proud of is our OK program, which stands for Our Kids. It is a program that's basically based on mentoring. It was founded in 1990 in Rancho Cordova, California. We have 193 kids that are in that program for us. 2 middle schools that are a feeder to a high school that we have. Now, the good thing about this program, the teachers will refer the kids to our sergeant and the officers that we have that will put on the program. But it's voluntary for the kids, so they have to volunteer to be actually in the program. The goal of it is to reduce incarceration and homicides among African American boys. Now, that was the intent and the purpose of the program, but we will accept anyone into the program, especially with the increasing number of Hispanics that we're seeing in our community. 6 cities currently have the OK program: Oakland, Monroe, Louisiana, Kansas City, Kansas, Omaha, Nebraska, and Indianapolis, Indiana, and of course, Little Rock. Some of our partners for this program are the school system. Of course, they love it. The teachers absolutely love it. And then our faith organizations. Most of our private funding comes from one of our mega churches that we have here in the city, so we've gotten them involved in helping us with that. And then having the role models, what we call teammates, that help us to go out and we meet with the kids. We meet with them every Saturday from 10 to 2, and we discuss a number of different things: critical thinking, reinforcing stereotypes. You know, it's one thing, I kind of put this in the mathematical equation when I ask kids, which is the greater of the 2 evils, to be stereotyped or to reinforce one? Now, what you think of me and what you see in me, I have little control over that if you're a cynical person. But to reinforce one, I have some control over that. And we talk to our young men about how you go about doing the things that you do, what you see when you look in the mirror, what you think of self, to build up that self-esteem. That has been tremendous for us in dealing with these young men. Guest speakers, we bring in a number of different folks in the community. A lot of times we try to get prominent African Americans in the community because it's extremely important for a young man to see someone from his background that shares his pigment, that says that, hey, I had some of your situations. My father was not in my home. My mother was addicted to drugs, but despite that, I went to college. Despite that, I was able to get out of public housing. And to hear that from someone that looks like you is a very, very strong endorsement that you can do some of the things that we're talking about doing. Lunch, that's a huge one. If I could give you any advice on how to get kids in your building so that you can try to corral them and provide resources to them, I would tell you to feed them. You would be surprised as to how many of these kids are hungry. That's probably the number one reason I bet you a lot of these kids are showing up for the services that we provide, because we provide lunch for them. Sports, of course, they all love that. We kind of have some intramural kind of things that we do with them as it relates to that. And then there's accountability. To remain in the program, then we will never officially kick you out, but you have to have a 2.5 GPA to do some of the things that we do on the fun things. We go on these field trips. We go to college campuses and allow them to see that. We take them to theme parks. But you have to make the grade in order to remain active to be able to participate in some of those activities. And then we monitor their report cards to where we were able to get permission from the parents to where they give us access to the school's reports, and we get a copy of that so that when the teacher reaches out to us to say this kid is having a problem, then we have an opportunity to reach out to that kid to try to get them back on track. My time is up. Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause for Little Rock.
And by that time, her mother had come to the door, and her mother said, I just brought her back from the hospital. Last night, a stray bullet came through her bedroom and whizzed across her forehead. And she had to deal with that, but was, of course, anxious. And when we think about gun violence, as Mayor Nutter brought out, it really is a public health issue. And so one of the things that we formed in New Haven is a New Haven Trauma Coalition, because what happened to that child is an example of adverse childhood experience. Now, Kaiser Permanente did a study over a decade ago that said if you have 5 adverse childhood experiences, that it has a great impact on your life. And if you think about their population, Kaiser Permanente, basically working middle-class people, they found that if you had 5 of these things in your life as a child, it would affect your life rate, it would affect whether or not you have chronic disease. You would likely have some sort of behavioral problem, mental health, and other chronic health problems. And so when you think about what our children, particularly in urban areas, are faced with, many of them have more than 5, and then we wonder why they have a hard time in school. So our Trauma Coalition is comprised of community partners, our police department, our New Haven Public Schools, and basically it is trying to develop a system of trauma-informed care that impacts our schools, promotes public safety, reduces violence, and empowers families. And so one of the things that we've learned, I had a school in my district that was a pilot program for for one of the programs under this category. It's called the Alive program. And they started out with 700 suspensions in this school per year. After 2 years, they're down to 29 suspensions. And so that basically shows that if you have a trauma-informed care program, it reduces suspensions. And I would argue if kids are not in the street unsupervised, that you're likely to have less chaos in the streets. So that's one. I think that we've really got to think of the gun violence that we have as a public health issue. And we've really got to take seriously the trauma that these children and families face every day. So the next thing is disengaged youth. You know, we know that 80% of our kids are fine. They're going to do fine. They may not be the greatest of students, but they're going to likely graduate from high school, and they're going to become employed and have some sort of career and be contributing members of their community. So I was elected in November. By the time I took office, there had been 3 deaths of teenage young people, and it's the same kind of death we talked about yesterday, largely black on black death, but at any rate, these were teenagers. And so I said to my superintendent, I said, what are we doing for kids in the schools for this? And he had a whole program of that. But then he said something that I'd heard from other superintendents. I could have told you that that child would either be shot or shoot. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if you could have told me, then why didn't you do something about it? And I thought, well, and then why didn't the superintendent prior to you do something about it? And why didn't the superintendent prior to him do something about it? Because each and every one of them have said to me, I could have told you. So then I said, well, you know, why don't you tell me then? Who are these kids? Why don't we identify them and really try to do something about it? And so one of the things that I think is a really great tool that all of you have is CompStat. And we decided that if we're going to really try to figure out who these kids are, because the reality is they could have told you afterwards when they looked back, but they couldn't have prospectively told you. And so I thought, well, let's try to see if we can come up with a system that does that. And we thought that we would use CompStat as the model. So what we've developed is something that we call City Youth Stat. And basically what we have done is bring together all of the people who touch the lives of disengaged youth, because they don't just deal with the police department, they don't just create problems in the school system, but they're likely to be part of the child protection system, they're likely to be part of the probation system that we have in our state, or the parole system that we have in our state. And so we thought, let's bring everybody together who touches those kids' lives. We have street outreach workers. They probably know who they are too. And the first thing that we did when we came together to figure out what we're going to do around identifying these kids and talking together about serving these kids is that we recognize that there are real difficulties in doing that. That you have HIPAA laws, that you have FERPA laws, and all of those things that really stand in the way of actually communicating with each other. And so as a result, we have all of these agencies spending a lot of resources on perhaps one family, one kid. And so the first thing we realized we had to do was to develop a release form, and then which we did. And then we had to figure out, well, how do we, once we've identified these kids, and we did, and we figured out there are about 400 of them in our community of about 130,000. So what we then did was we worked with the police, fire, teachers, street outreach workers, and just community volunteers, and we did a community canvas. And we knocked on the doors of the homes without really asking to speak to the child. And we wanted to talk to the parents to find out if they needed anything, because so often I hear as the mayor that it's the parents' fault. They're disengaged. They don't care. They don't come to meetings. But the reality is, if you have a child who is what my mom would call acting up, whenever you hear from the police or whenever you hear from the school, it's always bad news. And so we went there to basically say, do you need some help, and how can we help you? And we also got them to sign the release. And so we ultimately have started this program, and we figured out we really needed to have a way in which we could actually talk together as different agencies, the police department, the schools, the city youth department, our Department of Children and Families, and all of those. And there would be really no real easy way to do it. But we have emergency management system called VOC. I don't know if any of you have that in your city, and it allows everyone who's involved in a big snow event or a big hurricane event to actually communicate with each other online for that specific area. And so we asked the software makers who developed VOC to develop a system for all of the people who contact the lives of these families to go into what appears to be a secure chat room to actually chat about the family and the kind of services that they're providing. So if someone in the police department picked Johnny up on a certain day, his social worker would know and could comment. If Johnny was having a great day in school, the teacher could comment. He had a great day in school today. And so all of them could talk and plan together around how they intervene in this child's life. And we have just been doing it for a short time, but we really think that it will make all the difference in the world, because right now all of the answers are what I would call the forest answers or global answers, but the problems are really very specific, and it's kind of like the shotgun approach that President Clinton talked about, or the 22 approach. And I think that for some of these kids now, we really have to look at a more targeted approach. So that's one program that we think is really going to bear fruit. It's the result of a collaboration, which I think is really the important take-home word for all of us based upon what we've heard today. The other thing that we wanted to do, because we have the same problem that many of you have in terms of getting minority students eligible and as well prepared, thinking that public safety could be a real career for them. And so I have an organization in my town called the Firebirds. They are the black firefighters in New Haven. And in our community, in our state, you can actually become a firefighter 1 at 16 if you live in a volunteer firefighter area. If you live in an urban area, there's no way that you can ever compete with that because you wouldn't have had that training. So their idea was, well, why don't we start an after-school program that begins to provide the certificates and other kinds of training that you would get as firefighter 1. And so they were doing that for a few years. It kind of didn't really work out as well as they had hoped. And one of the things that I learned that many, particularly Denver, is doing a really great job in developing programs around stackable certificates for kids. And so I said to the superintendent, look, why don't we have something that includes police, that includes fire, but actually gives these kids throughout their high school experience stackable certificates that they can actually use in getting a career later, so that it's really creating opportunity for these young people. And then we realized that we did have University of New Haven, Henry C. Lee, in our community, and we said, well, if we could actually make it an academy and involve them, then we could get college credit during high school for these kids. And if we could combine our Gateway Community College so that if they didn't want to go to a 4-year college, they could go to a 2-year college, that would really solve a number of problems, particularly for our state universities. It's sometimes taking 6 years to get out of college. And a lot of people, particularly if you come from an impoverished background, you really need to start working as quickly as possible. So if we can get kids enough college credits so that they're actually maybe 2 years ahead of the game by the time they graduate from high school, then they're ready, one, to go into public safety, maybe not police, because in our state you have to be 21, but they're ready to go on in public safety because they've gotten this. But in our state, fire, you can become a firefighter at 18. And it begins to give kids hope and an opportunity, and it really solves a number of problems. So those are some of the things that we're doing, but we're even doing more fantastic work. I'm so pleased that I have Chief Dean Esserman as my chief, because he's creative and he is someone who gets things done. The most important thing for a mayor. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor. Good job. Good job.
Good morning. I am happy and proud to be with my mayor. She is beloved in New Haven and has a trait that is powerful. She's a remarkable listener, and people know it, as does her police chief. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
I was thinking of Mayor Parker from Houston's comment about going to hell, and perhaps you'd find these words comforting from an old Connecticut famous citizen, Mark Twain, who's remembered for saying that he always thought the temperature in heaven would be better, but he'd prefer the company in hell. So take heart. And we were talking in about 67, the Presidential Johnson Commission, and at Yale, there's a famous quote from LBJ where he said that even on his worst day as President of the United States, at least he was grateful he was not an American mayor. So I hope those words hearten you. Certainly, I'm grateful to be a guest of CCM. And I think it's appropriate that we followed the earlier presentation because one is a child before one is an adult. And I learned that in a very profound way in my former life when I was a young prosecutor in New York City. And I prosecuted a particularly violent domestic violence case. And as normal, the victim never made the call to the police that night, but a neighbor did. And this was a high publicity case in New York City that got the district attorney's attention, which trickled down to this lowly assistant district attorney. And we went to trial. And a friend of mine gave me Maggie Scarf's brilliant book, one of the great psychologists in the nation who wrote Unfinished Business and Intimate Partners, and now in her retirement years is a senior status at Yale as well. And, you know, it took a long time for this young woman, an Ivy League graduate like myself, living with an Ivy League graduate in a nice neighborhood in New York City, being beaten regularly by her Ivy League boyfriend, for her to open up to me. She never really did until after the trial was over, but where do you think this young man learned his behavior? And you know the answer. He learned it from his father. But what shook me to my core as a new young lawyer prosecutor was only after the trial was over did she finally tell me where she learned her behavior, because she had followed her mother's pattern. And I go back to the book with Maggie Scarf, and I sat with her one day in her living room. And this is a powerful thinker, and she's convinced me that if Newton got it right, that the great force of nature we've probably discovered in the universe is gravity, that probably the fundamental, or one of the fundamental forces of human behavior is familiarity. And you go back to what you know. And those forces are inexorable. And so breaking cycles of violence, my dear friend Chris Burbank, who I appointed to my committee as chair, I sit as chair of National Juvenile Justice and Child Protection, and I asked Chris to join my committee because he's a thoughtful man. But the cycle of violence needs to break much earlier than when one encounters one as an adult. And that's what brings us to today's presentation. Children, I've learned, follow their parents. We are their teachers. I've learned that later in life as a parent of 3 children. Family justice centers make all kinds of sense. They started in San Diego. Many of us have replicated them. And they're good ideas. But they're not good enough. It's sort of talking about reentry instead of diversion. And diversion is usually too late as well. So how does government reach a child? Because that's a complicated conversation to have. Is it a school resource officer in a school? Is it a summer PAL program or a PAL camp? We run a summer camp in the police department as well. It goes back to a conversation that I was lucky enough to participate in. I always have that effect on mayors, so I don't take it personally. Especially a good mayor. Luckily, a beloved mayor by me as well. You know what's funny? That's what all those mayors always say to me, including mine. But in 1991, the former chief of police, the beloved Chief Pastor, my boss who recruited me from New York City in '91, the first time I came to New Haven, sat down with the head of the Yale Child Study Center, this remarkable institution, part of the medical school of Yale, that is the center of thinking on child development from school-based management, where my dear friend Dr. Comer works, to genetics, to child psychology, to the Anna Freud Center. And they were talking about children exposed to violence and the work they were doing at Yale Child Study Center in the Mideast. And I remember my boss said, "What about New Haven?" And the answer was, "Where's that?" And of course, it's where Yale resides. And we started a very interesting conversation which has now lasted for 23 years. So much so that one night I got a call in '92 from Janet Reno. I didn't return it because I didn't think the Attorney General of the United States calls assistant police chiefs. She wanted to hear about this. And in '93, this fellow, an old pal of mine from the district attorney's office days, Eric Holder, sits with us in New Haven as the deputy attorney general. And we end up getting funding to become the National Center for Children Exposed to Violence. And that's where I'd like to begin, about children exposed to violence, and something that my dear friend Chuck Ramsey said when he used that analogy of an orchestra tuning up until the conductor comes, and it turns from a cacophony to a symphony. And something my mayor said about those handful of traumatic events which impact you forever. Children exposed to violence are impacted in ways that we are just not willing to acknowledge or embrace. They are powerful and they are lasting. So, for a long time, that story that our mayor said about knocking on the door with the girl, with the 8-year-old girl with the armband, the hand wristband from the hospital, we would not have identified as a victim because she didn't get hit. It was a lucky incident. It obviously wasn't lucky for her. What we've learned in decades in New Haven, really partnering with Yale and others, the Clifford Beers Center, some remarkable thinkers have found a home in New Haven over the years, is to redefine the definition of a victim. And it is hard to redefine the definition of a victim. It used to be the person who was shot by the bullet. Later it became, well, you know, even that group of children who were exposed to that violence, domestic or acute, chronic or acute, are victims themselves. What we've really now come to realize, as hard as it is to imagine, it took a long time to acknowledge that most crime goes unreported. Like the story of my son having his bike stolen, never reported to the Washington, D.C. police. So the FBI, which is in the job of collecting the crime stats from the 50 states, now acknowledges most crime goes unreported. It turns out most shots fired get unreported. It's now scientific. Just use a shot spotter system in one of the 85 cities in America, and you realize it's hard to embrace that 75% of the shots in every neighborhood, no one ever calls the police. It's not they don't call them late, it's they don't call them. Who's the victim? I would say that what Chuck Ramsey said yesterday about post-traumatic stress and an understanding that our officers who work with MAD, SAD, and BAD are significantly affected. How would you like to be a child growing up with fear? So we wrote a book years ago called Listening to Fear. And when you listen to fear like my mayor does, you understand that the definition of a victim changes dramatically. It isn't just how we codify the index offenses for the FBI or how we redefine a close call. You're not really a victim, you didn't get shot. It turns out children grow up with fear in many neighborhoods in the cities of America. And our scientific partners have taught us it's not a short-term effect. You go to school that morning rattled, and if you think that child with that cacophony in their head is hearing anything going on in that class, like someone else coming from a neighborhood where nothing happened that night. So quietly, and I don't even know if I've ever told the mayor, but for 23 years, I go to schools quietly with no fanfare, and I read to kids most weeks. And I've been doing that in 4 cities for 23 years. Just like I go to every shooting to this day, I go to every emergency room admission, I go to every wake, I go to every funeral. And I ask kids at the end of the day 2 questions at the end of my hour as we've gotten to know each other. And these are young kids. These are usually 9th and 10th graders, sometimes middle school kids. And the one question I ask them is, does anyone know anyone who's been shot? And I have never been in a classroom, never, where less than half the hands went up. You could have said that to me in 9th and 10th grade, and nobody's hand went up. Never. In 23 years have I been in a classroom where less than half the hands went up. And then I ask them one other question to tie to this earlier presentation about domestic violence. I tell them that they have a right to feel safe in their school, in their park, in their neighborhood, and even in their home. They have a right to feel safe. And if they don't, if that home is not a sanctuary, if their bedroom is not a sanctuary, tell somebody. And when I walk out, I always whisper in the ear of the teacher, let me know when you get the first shrug, pull on your sleeve. And more often than not, before the end of the day or the week, one of the kids in that classroom comes to tell their teacher or their coach or their counselor a secret they've been keeping in their house for a very long time. In the end, this is about our children. And our children are affected more profoundly, and the effects are more lasting than, as police, we have acknowledged for a long time, and it redefines the definition of victim. Thank you.
All right, let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thanks, Chief. All right, we're a little behind, so we're going to try to get a couple questions in, then we're going to wrap up because I know folks have flights to catch. So any questions or comments from any of our panelists? Yes, Mayor Cabaldon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just on the suspensions and expulsions issue, I mean, I think we're certainly trying to reduce the number, not increase the authority of principals to do more suspensions. It can appear like a quick fix, but I think the research has shown there's not a single scientific study that shows that the learning of other students improves by simply removing those children from the classroom. But there's plenty of research that shows after the first suspension, just one suspension increases the likelihood of dropping out permanently by 15 to 20%, 2 suspensions by 49%. And by the fourth, you really have almost no chance of completing high school. And so the impacts of suspension and expulsion as a behavior management strategy are severe, and the benefits have been shown to be not that significant. So I think the work that's happening in New Haven and elsewhere, certainly in California, to try to tackle behavior and acting out and willful defiance and all of those things in a direct sense, as opposed to simply trying to remove it from the classroom as though the child's going to leave the school and end up in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory and have a great day the rest of the time, is really the only solution that we can take if we're really going to solve the problem, not simply shift it to the prisons.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, Chief. Oh. Yeah, keep talking. He'll get you.
Okay. My name's Dwayne Flournoy. I'm a chief of police for the city of Hallandale Beach. I service the Broward School District, which has a population of about 270 students, 270,000 students. And about 2 years ago, we were brought to a meeting with the NAACP that dealt with how many arrests school resource officers and officers were making on school campuses. And we only had 700 some arrests for that school year, so we were thinking that we were doing a good job. But what was identified is that of those 700 students that were arrested, 560 of those students, it was their first arrest and their first time into the juvenile justice system. And subsequently, those kids, of those 560, within a year and a half of those students were arrested again. So the point came to, why are we arresting kids from school and introducing them to the juvenile justice system? So what started around that conversation was that all 16 chiefs, along with the school district, the prosecutor, the public defender, juvenile probation, we all got together and we came up with a collaborative agreement. And I would just ask you to point you to the Broward School District and look for the promise agreement, because last year, we only had 260 arrests. And once again, this is for nonviolent misdemeanor offenses, but we've seen where we can reduce arrests if we change the philosophy of breaking the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline by just changing how we deal with those kids. And law enforcement, don't take on school behavior. Make your school district deal with their school problems, because before SROs were introduced into schools, they dealt with their fights, they dealt with their disruption at lunches. They didn't make it a police problem, because if you call the police, you're going to get a police response.
All right, thanks, Chief. Last question, comment from anybody? Yes, Mayor Snyder.
Thank you. The area in our area in Santa Barbara, California, in the southern part of the county, we created about 6 years ago a task force on youth gangs and looking at prevention of youth violence. And what we found over the course of the time is the importance of connecting probation departments with schools, with our Parks and Rec department and our police department. And the situation being that each of those different agencies were working with the same group of kids but not talking to each other about what they were asking those kids to do, or how they were interacting with their parents or with other agencies. And once those silos were broken down and the probation officers knew what after school or summer school requirements were going on, and the schools knew what kind of probation terms and conditions were going on, and collaborated on what exactly each individual student needed, we're seeing a reduction in youth with probation terms and conditions go down by almost a half in the course of 5 years, and really that collaborative approach has been tremendous in actually dealing with the source of the problem and keeping the student at the center of the issue, and working with that individual on figuring out whatever it takes to get them to choose more healthy decisions in their life.
Awesome. Thanks, Mayor. Okay, let's give a round of applause for our panelists.